Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fifth installment of the HIMSS Northern California ePatient Summit. I'm Jason Johnson. I am president of HIMSS Northern California, and just wanted to thank you all for taking the time out of your days to attend the session today. We have had a fantastic group of speakers and panelists over the last few weeks, and we're disappointed this has to come to a close this week. We have a session tomorrow on the evolution of non-emergency transportation held by Uber Health, so don't miss that. But for now, we are going to talk about cybersecurity and remote patient monitoring. So we have a great speaker today, David Snyder. But before we get to him, I do want to point your attention to all the interactions that we're going to have throughout this session. So on your right, you have a chat window. That's a great way to connect to all of the other attendees of the session. Down on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the polls. We'll have a couple polls up throughout this talk. And then if you want to ask a question to the speaker, go ahead and use that ask a question functionality, and David will get to it during some dedicated time for questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce David Snyder. David figures out how to get things to work for information-intensive industries like healthcare. He has worked as a staff member and a consultant for both large and small organizations, and has an MBA and is a California registered engineer and CISSP. And a fun fact, all those years ago when I got started in cybersecurity, David was the one who endorsed my CISSP, so things always come full circle. With that, I will turn it over to David.
Good afternoon for those of you, well, I think in the US at least, coming to you from the HIMSS corner of my home. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can start the presentation. Should be coming up. And hopefully you're all seeing cybersecurity and the future of remote patient monitoring. I'm sure Jason will text me if there's any problem. So as we get into this, we're going to have probably about 45 minutes to go through quite a few slides. I'll go quickly. I will be making a version of the slides available afterwards. We'll talk about that later. But initially, let's just think about four big things. Remote patient monitoring is actually not that new, but it's definitely growing. Attacks on networks via device vulnerabilities are probably more important than the concerns about individual devices, and we'll get into some of that. A key point I would like everyone to take away from this is that remote patient monitoring is a system of systems. It's not something you can just focus on the device and make sure it's secure and then everything is okay. But you have networks connected to other networks, and I'll be showing some slides on that. And another point is that because it's a bunch of systems that are controlled by different people, it's actually everybody's responsibility to work on cybersecurity. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So if we could have Jason put the poll up, I'd like to see that. I don't see it at the bottom yet. I don't know if the poll is starting yet. There we go. You go to the bottom of the screen, click on that, and you can start to just click on a few answers in that poll. And I don't know if we're getting any responses yet. Getting a few, they're coming in, okay. Give that another couple of minutes. Don't be shy. So I'm going to go ahead with the slides. A little bit about myself, and then maybe we can go back to that poll in a minute. I actually started off my work career in respiratory therapy, taking care of patients, doing blood gas analyses. But then I went on for an engineering degree, became a registered engineer, worked in the environmental industry, worked in the credit card industry when e-commerce got started. But going back to my healthcare background, I actually ran a meetup about healthcare technology for a number of years and picked up the information security credential along the way. Remote patient monitoring is something that actually was imagined a long time ago. If you can believe it, this image is from 1924, and you can see that they were thinking even then that a physician or other clinician would be able to have a central place to look at information about a patient. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about the context for remote patient monitoring, how it works, this concept of it being a systems of systems and needing teamwork, and then getting into the cybersecurity concerns of vulnerabilities, risk assessment, and some best practices. If you're familiar with some of this, you'll recognize this is a heart monitor for someone who has an implanted pacemaker or implanted defibrillator. And typically the model is that that information gets transmitted to the clinician. And just last month on TV, it was pointed out that we're having a lot more use of telehealth these days in the COVID-19 days because people are trying to avoid going into the clinic. Some of those devices that are being used include wearables like a watch that can monitor the heart rate, glucometers and insulin pumps, an implantable cardiac pacemaker, CPAP machines, which have a chip in them that allows communication via cellular to a central database where the respiratory therapist and the doctor can see how your experience has been going each night with the device. Scales, blood pressure cuffs, implantable pacemakers, and the devices for monitoring and adjusting those pacemakers, pulse oximeters, thermometers. This is a peak flow device for measuring how fast someone can breathe out if they have a chronic lung disease. And there are even collections of devices that include a stethoscope and what's known as an otoscope for looking in the ear that can send recordings and images over to the doctor. Healthcare is big industry, and we really have been focused a great deal in cybersecurity for medical devices on what goes on in hospitals. But there's increasing use of remote monitoring. And we have home health services where they send a nurse or a caregiver into the home, and we're increasingly going to see them using some of these devices to record information to share with the clinician rather than having that patient having to go into the clinic. And if you look at the number of patients who are being taken care of at home, there's even more that are in independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing facilities who can benefit from remote patient monitoring. The reason we're seeing a bigger interest in remote patient monitoring is an aging population with chronic illnesses. There's going to be a shortage of caregivers and professionals as a lot of doctors and nurses are nearing retirement age. There are incentives to reduce hospital readmissions. Hospitals are penalized if someone is readmitted within 30 days. There's a bunch of new telehealth reimbursement codes that have come out, and some of them can be used for remote patient monitoring, and we'll talk about that. Lots more devices coming on the market. The technology is amazing. And as we've noted, COVID-19 has got us all staying at home as much as possible, and avoiding a clinic visit is a good idea. So the people who could benefit from remote patient monitoring is this population of people with chronic illnesses. And this is a little bit old data, so the numbers could even be larger. But that's almost half the population has some kind of chronic diseases, and many of those diseases are things that you will want to monitor. For example, heart disease, chronic lung disease, diabetes, and these are a big factor in our healthcare costs today. So high blood pressure, congestive heart failure, other heart problems, lung disease, kidney disease, and even keeping track of whether people are taking their medications the way they're supposed to. I'll go very quickly through the list of reimbursement codes. You'll be able to get some of this information later. So it's not only setting up the equipment, doing the data recording, having the doctor or other staff spend time on interpreting it and communicating with the patient. Certainly collecting that data and going over it. And then they even have a code for some additional time if it's complicated. And just recently, you may have heard about the CARES Act. It expanded the use of telehealth, and it doesn't talk a lot about remote patient monitoring, but they go hand in hand. And we're going to see more on this, I expect, in coming months. So let's start to dive into how it works. Here's the basic view that's been held for a long time, but then you'll see it can even be broken down a little bit more. Certainly you want to set it up with the patient, collect the device, collect the information from the device, transmit it, and then have the clinician review it. But there's a lot of pieces in this. The device itself, such as an EKG monitor or a blood pressure cuff, how that communication happens locally, how it goes across the telephone wires or the internet, and whether it goes to the healthcare delivery organization or via some interim cloud data service, into the electronic medical record, and then, of course, being accessed by the clinicians. So let's run that other poll again, if we may. Looking for the new poll. There we go, second poll. There's a question that came up. Yes, a modified form version of the slides will be made available. But the poll, there we go. Well, I'm going to go back to the slides and tell you that, at least according to some of the research, glucose meters are indeed probably one of the most common devices, along with EKG devices and blood pressure monitors. I think CPAP machines are coming up strong. I think there's about 8 million of them in use in the United States, or even more. So in terms of cybersecurity, it's been good to see that the National Institute of Science and Technology has started a program last year where they're developing a model, a basic idea of how it all works so that cybersecurity principles can be applied. And this is their model. They talk about the patient home, how that device may connect in. In their model, they've got it going through, it looks like some sort of a home network Wi-Fi device to some sort of interim platform provider, and then over to the healthcare organization where the clinicians can view it. I'd like to propose a little bit different model to take a look at that. So on the left, you've got myriad devices that can be hooked up, and they can use Bluetooth, Ethernet, cellular connections, lots of different ways. But you're usually going to have some interim type of device that's going to be connecting, whether it connects to a smartphone and then goes out over cellular or the home Wi-Fi. Some providers of this equipment provide a hub that connects to Wi-Fi. And then you're typically going to have some sort of service that's going to collect all this data in one place. We'll call it a cloud platform or a cloud service. And then coming over to the electronic medical record in the healthcare organization, where doctors and other clinicians are going to be accessing it. Some of these devices are versatile. This is for monitoring a pacemaker, and you can see the different jacks on the back, and you can connect with a landline, cellular, or various internet connections. Remote patient monitoring has a lot of similarities with devices that are used in hospitals. We certainly are concerned about availability because patient safety depends on it, as we are also concerned about the integrity of the data. You may have personal health information on the device. There's the potential for malicious connections. You need to keep things patched and updated. And you also need to make sure, whether it's an in-hospital device or at home, that proper authentication is done and, if appropriate, encryption. But there's differences too. Hospital equipment tends to be much more expensive, bigger, used for a longer period of time in the environment, whereas remote monitoring devices are probably in most cases less than $100 and only sometimes more than $100. You have on-site support in a hospital. At home or in a nursing facility, you're not as likely to have that kind of IT support. Hospital networks are set up with logging and monitoring. You're less likely to have that with a remote monitoring device. And the way networks are set up are different. And in a hospital, you have a lot of people around to help, but maybe at home, not so much. So the Health Sector Council is one of the departments in Health and Human Services, and they've already acknowledged that there are some challenges for remote monitoring. There can be interface issues if you're on the home Wi-Fi, quality issues. There may not be the same security features for in a home Wi-Fi as opposed to a hospital network. And they acknowledge that some patients may not have as an easy time understanding how to operate the devices. So let's think about this process. and go a little deeper into this model. You certainly have the information coming from the home to the platform, and there's usually in the database, in the cloud service, not only a database, but a dashboard to organize that information and present it to the healthcare organization, where the physicians can look at it and see not all of the data, but the relevant data, because you can collect a lot of data and become inundated with it. Sometimes the information may go direct to the hospital or clinic if they have the network set up to do that. Where the information is collected is where some of the vulnerabilities we're discussing, can come up. Can also be vulnerabilities when the information is transmitted. The place where the information is stored and processed can be attacked. Or, of course, the hospital or clinic network can be attacked. So in all of this, whose role is it to be responsible for cybersecurity? And there's a story about everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. It's an important job, and everybody was asked to do it. Everybody was sure somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did. Somebody got angry about it because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized everybody wouldn't do it. And it ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have done. I find this a helpful reminder when we're thinking about this ecosystem. Who is everybody? Not just the hospital staff, but it's the end user, the device manufacturer, the people making the network equipment, the telecommunications carriers, the cloud service, the clinical engineers, and even the regulatory agencies and standards organizations. They all have a role to play. And the Food and Drug Administration has acknowledged this. They say it's a shared responsibility among stakeholders, and they're encouraging collaboration. But it really, for remote patient monitoring, it really hasn't emerged how this is supposed to happen. Much more of the focus has been on devices used in hospitals. So let's take another way of looking at this system of systems. The device is provided by a distributor who gets it from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer relies on a supply chain to get the components. And these are all places where you can have security concerns. There are the regulatory agencies that are involved, the FDA, the FCC, and Health and Human Services, and of course the standards organizations and security researchers. The FDA, though, is only responsible for regulating devices. It's the FCC that regulates the telecommunications. And of course, HIPAA applies to the healthcare delivery organizations and their business partners, their business associates who may be storing or processing health information. But what I'm advocating, and what I really want people to take away from this, is that you need a holistic view. And who's going to be able to look across all of these different organizational boundaries? Can the device manufacturer do that? Maybe the cloud platform provider, if they coordinate with everybody. But practically speaking, I think it's the healthcare delivery organization most often that's going to be in the position to do this, to have this view. And Mayo Clinic already has a process for screening devices they're going to use in the hospital. I think the procurement process and the contracting process is where this can be done. And if you're a smaller healthcare delivery organization that doesn't have the IT resources to have this whole view, you're probably going to need some security consultants to help. So let's start diving into cybersecurity. If you're not familiar, these are the key concepts in cybersecurity. And most often, the focus is on confidentiality. Confidentiality is mostly a privacy issue, but it can also have a safety issue if something gets out and somebody can do something bad with that personal information. But from a safety perspective, I think its integrity is also important. You need the right data. You need to know where it came from. You need that data to be available when it's needed and available within the system the way it is needed. And usability is even a factor, because if you're inundated with too much data, it's hard to know what's going on. Or if the user has difficulty getting the device to work properly, that's a problem too. Connected devices can be targets. Someone can invade the network and attack that device. But I think it's going to be more of a problem for those devices to be an entry point to get in and attack the hospital network. And I just want to note for a minute that cybersecurity is not just about attacks. This is an example where a diabetes device was interfered with by an app that was being used for contact tracing. So you have to think it's about compatibility and interoperability as well. In cybersecurity, we talk about vulnerabilities, weaknesses that can be attacked. The threat is what's going to be doing the attacking to exploit that vulnerability. And in fact, the actual instance when something bad happens, that's called an exploit. To think about it more simply, you can think of a vulnerability as an unlocked door. The threat is that burglar or hacker or bad software or something. And the exploit is when something bad actually happens. So in this model of system of systems, the databases storing the data are probably one of the primary targets. That's where the personal health information that's so valuable is stored. And a real area that can be attacked is mistakes by people, either not having a good enough password, not configuring things properly, being susceptible to a phishing attack. And these are some of the things that are not unique to remote patient monitoring equipment, but have to be considered. And we'll get into talking about in the design process how to consider these things. I think some of the top threats that we're going to be facing as remote patient monitoring becomes more widely adopted is, of course, phishing attacks, denial of service, ransomware, where the service is interrupted and you have to pay money to re-enable it, tampering with these devices because the environment they're in, people can get at them, so-called man-in-the-middle attacks, where somebody gets into the communication system and listens to the data going back and forth. And then these so-called advanced persistent threats. These are less common, but very serious when very sophisticated attackers like nation states start to try to interrupt and take advantage of what's out there. This is not theoretical. There are vulnerabilities that have been discovered in devices. These ones listed here are for several cardiac devices and an insulin pump. But there's a long list, and we don't have time to go into what's really been discovered. But you have to recognize that it's very hard to build these devices and make them without vulnerabilities or not, and you have to worry about new vulnerabilities that come up. Now, the FDA is not aware of instances where patients been harmed, but when you talk to doctors and other professionals, they kind of have a feeling that there may have been adverse events. And I think the problem is we don't really have a good way to know whether that injury or the patient becoming more ill is a result of something bad happening with the device, because we just don't have good reporting. Another key concept I would like everyone to take away is that in order to work in this field, you have to think like an attacker. And let's take another look at this model. Again, in the devices, you can be tampered with. They can be an entry point into the network. Someone can attack the telecommunications. They can attack the platform where the data is being stored and analyzed, or they can get right into the hospital or clinic network. Here's another concept from cybersecurity, the so-called kill chain. If you read left to right, a serious attacker is going to have some decisions to make about why they're doing it, what they're going to try and do. Do they want to steal data or just interfere? And then what pathway are they going to choose? Are they going to use hacking tools that are readily available in the dark web? Or are they going to create something new? How are they going to get in? Are they going to use a phishing attack or an insider or compromise one of the components that goes into a device? And then when they actually make the attack, they're going to look at how well they did and decide whether to go further. Phishing, denial of service, ransomware, and getting from one piece of equipment on the network into another more sensitive part of the network. These are common attacks. So now I'm going to go through a few of the cybersecurity methodologies. Risk assessment is certainly one of the first things you do. You can think of risk assessment as a journey. You start out by characterizing what the devices are like, what risks are incumbent in them, inherent, what challenges are there for mitigating, and how is the organization going to address it. The steps in risk assessment are characterizing, identifying those vulnerabilities, identifying the threats, calculating some sort of a probability, assessing how bad things could be, and then calculating the risk as a product of the chances of something happen with how bad it might be. Then you analyze the controls and see, after you've put in your mitigating controls, whether the residual risks are tolerable. Now, the National Institute of Science and Technology offers a framework for thinking about security, and this is, you can recognize some of the steps from risk assessment where you identify what you have, but also think about your business environment, how everything fits together. When you think about protecting that network and those pieces of equipment, you need awareness training, you need maintenance, and you need a way to actually detect if something bad is happening. And that's usually done with monitoring and logging. And once you have an incident, you have to have a plan to respond and do something about it, and a plan how to recover. And that might involve relying on backups. You've heard of ransomware attacks where the backups didn't work. You have to make sure that they do. Of course, this whole framework was designed initially with a single organization in mind. And I've been saying that for remote patient monitoring, you have to think about it as a system of systems, an ecosystem. And so there's probably some different ways you need to think about these things when approaching this ecosystem. Here's a model of the life cycle of medical devices and potential threats. And it's usually discussed in terms of, well, here's what the medical device manufacturers have to do. Here's what the healthcare delivery organizations have to do. But I'm advocating that we think about it more holistically. And when you think about that there's an interim platform provider who's probably involved, they have to be considered also as part of the system. So what are some of the best practices? Well, if you're going to be looking at this ecosystem, you've got to ask a lot of questions about those business partners. And this is too long a list to go through one by one, but I think if you scan through them, you get the general idea. You want to know whether those vendors are doing a good job at security in their realm, and especially in the ways that things connect from one area to the next. Sort of the end-to-end security picture. Often we talk about the life cycle view of an asset, where you think about security not only in designing the device, but how it's built, how it's deployed, and I'll go through a couple of these steps. When you're doing design, I don't know if you can read the small print, but during requirements, when you're trying to think about what it is you're going to build, you have to also think about some of the things that can go wrong. And then when you're actually doing the design, making sure that security professionals have a look at it. And then when you're writing the software for it, making sure that it's done properly and that you don't introduce vulnerabilities. And when you start getting ready to deploy, there's a bunch to think about. And I am especially fond of pointing out that you need to do monitoring and logging so that you can detect incidents and respond to them. And of course, keep everything updated and patched. In the design stage, you want to make sure that access to the device is properly authenticated with a username and password, and possibly multi-factor authentication at some stages. That devices don't get sent out with a default username and password that can be left, but that when you set something up, it has to have a unique and secure username and password set up. It's good that these devices not stay on the network when they're not needed. Transmissions should be encrypted. If you can avoid storing confidential information, all the better. But if you do store it, you need to encrypt it. I've been talking about logging and monitoring and updating and patching. It can't be said often enough. And you even need to think about when you decommission the device that it's done securely. And this is all during the design phase. If you don't think about it then, it's hard to add on later. Then when you go to build the device, looking at the bill of materials and the software bill of materials to see, are there any places where a vulnerability may be getting introduced? Do you know the people that are supplying your various components? When you're setting up encryption, is that done under secure conditions? Is the device built so that it's not easy to get inside and introduce some sort of sniffing device? When you send the devices out, is it done in a way that somebody isn't going to get a hold of it and be able to tamper with it? And as I said earlier, that this user IDs and passwords actually get changed to something secure during setup. And users are probably going to need technical support, and that needs to be planned. And then during operating, not just the logging, but the monitoring and the updating. And these devices need to be tested. And really, we should have outside parties take a look at that, because you quite often can't recognize your own mistakes. And so that's why we have vulnerability scans and penetration tests on these kinds of systems. And it will be very interesting to think about doing that on a system of systems, or whether it needs to be done individually. And of course, if something happens, how do you detect it? How do you respond? Who's going to respond? Whose job is it? Again, it's everybody's responsibility, and then maybe sometimes nobody's, unless you plan ahead. And you need to do training. And you need to test your detection and response system to make sure it really works. And that means some tabletop exercises and maybe even full-scale exercises. And finally, are you set up to get rid of personal information when its device is end of life, and including getting rid of any codes that are used to connect to the networks? So I think I'm allowing enough time here for some questions and answers. I want to thank everybody for joining. Again, I'll be making some of the slides available, a version of the slides without the animations. That'll probably take me a day or two to get ready. Just to review, we've talked about the picture of how the demand for remote patient monitoring is growing, how it works, the key concept that this is a system of systems that requires all of the stakeholders to be involved in cybersecurity. And then we talked about some of the things that can go wrong and how to plan for them. So this is who I am and how to reach me. And I think the best way to get these the slides is going to be to use the contact form at my website. So please make a note of it. And it's not up there yet, but like I say, in a day or two it will. And now would be a good time for Q&A. So I'm going to end the presentation. I guess I'll leave that slide up, but ask Jason if he maybe wants to moderate. I see that there's a bunch.
And we will be sending out the recording and the slides as a follow-up to this, so you don't have to seek anywhere. We'll send them to you, and it looks like we have a couple questions here. So the first one up at the top with the most votes is, David, do you have any input on billing for loop recorder remote checks? We have a nurse in the hospital reviewing data on a vendor's website at the end of the month, and then downloads a report that the MD notes in Epic.
I'm not sure of the term loop recorder, so I'm going to have to defer on that one and maybe get back. If you want to pose that question via the contact form, I can look into it. Maybe you can explain what you mean by loop recorder.
And then what about any good examples of companies who are doing a good job coordinating the security of data from the device to the health system, kind of securing the supply chain? I made a comment in here for Rebecca that Mayo Clinic has done a bunch of work on here and has documented quite a bit on kind of hardware security and remote monitoring. But David, what else do you have to add?
Well, that was one of the points I think I mentioned only very quickly in passing a few minutes ago. Mayo Clinic on their website actually has some examples of their procurement process and the kind of questions they ask manufacturers of devices when they're thinking of buying a cardiac monitor or an infusion pump or something to use in the hospital. It's a little different, and I don't really know yet of anyone doing this organizationally. If there are any of the people on the call who are members of healthcare delivery organizations who are starting to do this. I would love to hear from you on the website and at my email address. If you have some best practices, so I may even be able to add those in an update to the presentation. So next question, there exists a great issue regarding data ownership and data infrastructure. Who owns the data? I agree, this is something that's constantly being discussed. You hear a lot of lip service to the effect that it's the patient's data and patients should have access to it. And yeah, there are increasing efforts to make data available to patients through hospital and clinic portals. But there's another side of this that you have to remember is that hospitals and doctors are legally responsible for the documentation they do of the care that they provide. And in fact, those documents can be discovered and subpoenaed if there's a lawsuit over something. So they have to be very careful and have legal responsibilities with respect to managing that data. So it's not a clear-cut answer of who owns the data. We certainly, I think everybody would agree, we want patients to be able to get the data they need. We also want patients to be able to understand that data, and that is not a trivial subject because the level of medical understanding of each of us is quite variable. So one more question. Any thoughts, experience with solutions that have a constant motion tracking functionality for post-acute monitoring regarding cybersecurity concerns? I don't have any particular experience, but if I understand the question correctly, you're probably talking about some of the devices for activity monitoring, whether it's a Fitbit type of exercise and mobility monitoring, or some of the tools that are being used to monitor someone who's perhaps living alone at home, and there's a concern whether they have a fall, or there's even some monitoring of how their daily activities are going on. These are all sensitive pieces of information that could be getting stored either in that cloud platform that I described or somewhere along the line. And the kinds of information that's being collected has to be encrypted when it's transmitted, encrypted when it's stored, and the places where it's stored protected with all of the best practices for managing vulnerabilities and preventing exploits. So I hope that's been helpful to everyone. We'll stay on for another couple of minutes if there are additional questions. Otherwise, I invite you to go in and look at the website. I don't know if am I back to sharing again here? Think so.
Yeah, so thank you very much, David, for presenting. It was fantastic. This is we decided on this topic before the COVID crisis started, and it became even more relevant when that crisis began. So I think it's definitely one of the silver linings. If you can find a silver lining in a pandemic, I think this is the silver lining of the pandemic: is wide acceptance of telehealth, billable for telehealth. But now security has to play catch up. A lot of this stuff has been deployed in haste because of COVID-19. Security has been baked into some and not others. So now it's really up to the industry to catch up and enable this amazing technology.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, David. Thank you, everyone. Please join us tomorrow for our very last session of the ePatient Summit, Reinventing Non-Emergency Transportation with Uber Health. Should be really great. Everyone stay healthy and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Take care.